Let me just start by introducing myself. My name is Marc Forni. I'm based in Hanoi for the last 2 years. Started the World Bank 20 years ago. But forget about the World Bank experience that I have and think about the fact that I spent 3 years in investment banking, raising money for renewable energy generation companies 12, 15 years ago. And what I'm going to present is really based on that perspective, that experience of raising money for activities that make financial sense. And oftentimes when we think about low carbon investments, climate mitigation investments, we think, okay, there's a trade-off between the impact of benefits to the environment and the economic impacts of those benefits. And what I want to show here this morning is that, in fact, the world has changed a lot. The world has changed a lot with regards to the costs associated with climate mitigation investments or green investments. The world has changed a lot in the last couple of years with regards to who is driving climate action, where the financial markets are going in this space, and how it is that ministries of finance can play an increasingly important role in being able to tap into the rapidly growing and evolving carbon finance markets. As a sneak preview to what the conclusion of my presentation will be, it's that I've been working with Ho Chi Minh for the past year and a half, to think about a whole bunch of different development challenges. And one of those development challenges is thinking about how to support their pathway to a low carbon city. What we have done and what I'm going to present in terms of the operationalization of accessing the carbon finance markets is an investment program that, if implemented at full scale, just in the city of Ho Chi Minh, will reduce 109 million tons of CO2 over 10 years. And what does that number mean? What does that number represent? That number represents 65% of the national government's NDC commitment until 2030. So we're talking about one city, one large investment program that would, as a subnational entity, be able to allow the national government to move 65% of the way towards the accomplishment of the reductions of 165 million tons that they've committed by 2030. So it's big. And what we're talking about is an investment program that could tap the voluntary carbon finance market in the order of about $2.5 billion. So this is $2.5 billion coming in to one city, tapping into the voluntary carbon finance market, enabling the country to raise the sufficient resources to make the investments to achieve its NDC. And this is a different way of thinking about how it is that we can plan and invest to reduce emissions. We can go into more details later, but this is the type of thing that we're promoting. I just flew in last night from Bangkok, where we have clients from the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and one of the other, I forget who. But we're talking about this exact same program, and how is it that we can support this type of program in cities in ASEAN region. And we're in Bangkok, which is interesting because the city of Bangkok last week sold carbon offsets to the government of Switzerland for an e-bus program. That means that the government of Bangkok invested in e-buses. They had a delta in the reduction of emissions that they could easily measure. They packaged those emission reductions and they sold them to the government of Switzerland. This is one of the first instances of a city selling to a national government, and is the beginning of something that's going to be very, very big. And what we're talking about with Ho Chi Minh is something 1,000 times that size. So we see certain actions in the market, we see momentum, we see enormous demand from buyers for these types of credits, and we see an inability to meet the supply of offsets that the market is demanding. And so how is it that ministries of finance can work with ministries of environment and subnational governments to better enable access to these markets? Because accessing these markets is fundamentally important to achieving the NDCs while using new and different sources of funding to accomplish that goal. So why now? Why can I talk about this now? What's different? Well, we know that climate impacts are increasing. If you take this event, this heat dome, I'm from Washington State in the US, and the temperatures were 10 degrees Fahrenheit higher than they'd ever been 2 summers ago. And the first attributable fully to climate change event happened. We've seen other types of events like that happening in other parts of the world, and there's increasing actual tangible impacts that we can feel. And so nobody's making progress. Nothing's working. We don't see a pathway to actually go to a 2-degree world. So something has to change. And what's changed? What's changed is the voluntary carbon finance market that we see having tremendous potential to drive capital to these investments from the global south, global north to the global south. We see leadership like from BlackRock, the asset manager of almost $10 trillion, telling companies we want to see net zero plans. We see companies creating net zero plans. These companies are creating net zero plans because they make more money that way. To give an example, Puma, the apparel company, they make a brand of yoga gear that is carbon neutral. They sell that yoga gear for $5 more than what they would sell their typical yoga gear. That $5 is more than what it costs for them to be net zero by buying offsets and by upgrading some of their operations. So they're making a profit because consumers around the world realize that governments are not going to solve this problem. Consumers around the world are willing to pay. Consumers are the ones that are driving the net zero commitments, that are enabling or encouraging businesses to make these changes, and businesses are the ones driving the voluntary market. As an example, I had a call with Shell 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, talked to one person and they said, well, you know, we're not really sure what this market looks like. We're not really sure what we're going to be able to buy. And this is the largest buyer in the world. 2 months ago, I had a call with a dozen people from Shell, all of whom wanted some piece of the type of program that we're talking about here, because they see the trend. They see the growing demand for offsets, and they see a lack of supply. And this program that we're going to talk about, that again can be enabled by the enabling environment that ministries of finance can set in partnership with ministries of environment and other parts of government. This can create that type of supply that is being demanded. So what's the difference between compliance and voluntary? There's different carbon pricing mechanisms, there's carbon taxes, there's emission trading schemes that are domestic, and then there's carbon crediting mechanisms. The emission trading schemes are cap and trade, so you have a certain amount of emissions and you have to reduce those, and you can industry can trade emissions based on who can reduce their emissions most efficiently. Carbon crediting is where a specific project is going to reduce emissions, and the value of the emissions can be captured, monitored, reported, and verified. And those credits could either feed into a domestic emission trading scheme, they could feed into international emission trading schemes. There's schemes in this region that are able to purchase offsets that are generated elsewhere. But these are the three basic types of compliance market systems. Voluntary market is maybe also described as a market that is about commit and comply. Committing by companies around the world and then complying with that by increasing the efficiency of their operations, changing the source of energy to more renewable energy, and then with the residual buying offsets. And this is the area where we're focused. So I described a little bit here. The compliance market is largest by far. The EU ETS, the most established, biggest in the world. But there's an enormous opportunity for the voluntary market, the crediting side, to participate at greater scale, where revenue can be raised in new and different ways to, again, finance those climate mitigation interventions that will have a meaningful impact on achieving NDC from sources of funding that don't go onto a government's balance sheet, that could be purely participated in the private market. We see dramatic growth in recent years. We expect that growth to continue. And we see that growth driven by the net zero commitments by companies, which is driven by consumers and driven by institutional investors who, again, recognize that governments alone cannot come together and solve this problem. We see and expect through the assembly of a number of different task forces, including the voluntary task force on carbon markets that was led by Marc Forni and Bill Winters from Standard Chartered, really dramatic growth. But we do not see supply coming up to meet that growth. And we see challenges in supply. We see challenges in supply in nature-based solutions that you would have heard of, you may have read about with regards to deforestation or afforestation. There's questions in how we measure things. What I'm going to talk about is different because there is guaranteed in terms of emission reductions. We don't have some of the challenges that the nature-based side has, and we can be certain that these emissions will be reduced. We can be certain over what period they will be reduced, and we see increasing demand for these types of emissions. We see huge variation in pricing, and over time, we expect convergence in pricing as standards continue to converge, as the quality of these offsets improve. And quality really is defined as, can we actually measure the baseline and can we measure the impact of investments with credibility? So this is a little bit about the market, as I've discussed and described. I don't want to spend too much time because I see there's not that much time associated. So cities. Cities are responsible for 70% of emissions around the world, 75%. But we see very few programs that are systematically implemented in cities. We see programs in the US, Europe, OECD countries that are specific incentive programs done at subnational government, let's say to provide subsidies for rooftop solar or to provide subsidies for energy efficiency. We see energy utilities that will pay households for changing the way they monitor and manage their heating and cooling systems. We see many, many different fragmented things that are financed by subsidies that are paid for by taxpayers. This is one way that has been relatively effective in some developed markets. But developing markets in the Global South doesn't have the resources for these subsidies. And without these subsidies, it's hard to trigger action at scale. So how can we work in a way to aggregate a whole bunch of small actions to have impact at scale that will generate the market that's required to provide these services of design and engineering and contractors who are able to actually complete these works. These very small works that have high transaction costs as individual activities, but when aggregated together, have real impact. And then transport clearly being an additional driver, in addition to buildings that are responsible for 30% of global emissions. All of these are very, very small interventions on their own. So we see small fragmented activities. We see a lack of interest from banks to lend because they don't understand the project risk. We see a lack of interest from contractors to participate because they don't see a big market. We see a great potential for renewable generation, but we don't see suppliers coming in because household to household, building to building, costs too much to sell the case to be able to do these things. So how do we think differently in terms of the institutional mechanism? And there's three factors that allow us to think that things have changed. We see cities taking more and more leadership. We see net zero plans by cities around the world. We see these small programs that, when aggregated, actually are quite big, that are implemented by subnational governments around the world. We see a dramatic cost reduction in energy generation for renewable and for storage and for energy efficiency. A 10 times decrease in cost from when I was raising money for these companies 10, 15 years ago. And then we see that growth in the voluntary market. So how can we aggregate the small interventions into something very, very big when we're talking about all these individual assets? So we're thinking of rooftop building, retrofitting buildings, public and private, and within those buildings, commercial, residential, and industrial. And with industrial, segmenting out different types of industrial buildings like ready-made garment manufacturing, electronic manufacturing, cement manufacturing, so that we can have solutions that can be taken to these asset owners in a way that reduces their transaction cost to figure out what to do. So if we take this hotel, maybe it's $5 million of investments in energy efficiency, and maybe the hotel could save $2.5 million a year. But as a hotel manager, who cares about $2.5 million? It's not that big. $5 million isn't that big, especially when it's going to cost them $1 million to figure out what to do. And it's going to cost them even more to get the debt, if they can secure that debt, to be able to make these interventions. But if we have design engineers, if we have contractors, if we have everybody coming to, let's say, this hotel to say, here's the 32 investments, here's your capital cost, here's your annual savings, here's the emission reduction, and here's what we think that we could package this emission reduction and sell it in the market for. And here's how we can bring that money forward to you, as opposed to waiting for 10 years of cash flows, which makes it much more attractive for individual asset owners. This is the type of thing that we're talking about, encouraging an ecosystem, because we can catalyze demand, because we're doing something at scale by aggregating small investments, with cities taking the lead in how it is that these interventions happen by addressing their portfolio of assets, as well as enabling the private sector to participate as well, and connecting the private sector to the voluntary market. So this is a unique institutional mechanism which will enable us to accelerate action at scale, and it's profitable. These investments just simply make financial sense if you can reduce the transaction costs. If you can make it easy for asset owners to do them, there's no reason not to do them. It's hard now, and they're not big enough to care. So how is it that we can enable them, this market, to care by aggregating and achieving scale? So it's built on this mechanism, overcoming these challenges of scale, and finding a way to swap out a typical subsidy for access to the voluntary market that provides the financial incentive that, in the case of buildings, could substantially, between, let's say, 30 and 50%, depending on the price the offset can be sold at, to actually reduce the upfront capital cost by 30 to 50%. That's real also. So what does the implementation mechanism look like? City government, subnational government, could borrow resources or use its own resources to make interventions on its own portfolio of assets, its portfolio of public buildings, its portfolio of vehicles, especially motorbikes, as I'll get to, and be able to, in doing so, create market demand for contractors and engineers to provide rooftop solar at a larger scale, to make investments in energy efficiency at larger scale, and to work with the banking sector to help those banks understand the project risk, the risk associated that changing the lights, for example, will actually lead to the emission reduction as promised. And we can insure it too. So for over a decade, there's been insurance for these types of interventions, which means we can guarantee them, which means we can bring debt, which means we can bring forward long-term payments of carbon finance. So just as to throw out some numbers, we've done some homework associated. There's 100 slides of financial model outputs that I won't show. These are just some of the higher level ones. but $1.4 billion in energy efficiency investments, combining public and private sector, $37.5 billion of rooftop solar capital investments, $67 million of streetlights, and a $7.2 billion market just for swapping to e-motorbikes from combustion motorbikes. So if we take energy efficiency retrofit, $1.4 billion of upfront investment, over 10 years you're saving $8.2 billion. That's enormous savings. It's a no-brainer, but the transaction costs have to be reduced to be able to understand how to deploy that $1.4 billion. And then offset savings. If these offsets could be sold for $25 a ton, this is wiping out the capital costs. So very, very financially attractive. We've gone into detail in terms of public and private buildings, estimating the number of million square meters that the addressable market is, the capital costs, the offset savings, and the total tons of emissions that are saved. Same when we're looking at LED streetlights, we've looked at different types of approaches, capital costs and savings over time. Motorbikes. So motorbikes are especially interesting because the cost of the motorbike is relatively low compared to the amount of emissions it puts out. So if you're able to reduce the emissions, then you can have a financially attractive opportunity to switch to electric motorbikes. In addition, you don't have to deal with the charging challenges, charging station challenges that you do for four-wheel vehicles and buses, where there's capital investment. These can just plug in. And somebody on my team did the market entry strategy for the largest e-vehicle manufacturer in Vietnam. And their entire plan for charging was simply to work with 7-Elevens and these types of small stores to enable charging. My point is the market will come, and it is a fairly straightforward thing to do. And when we're talking about motorbikes for ride-hailing and for delivery, that could take out half the upfront capital costs associated. So that's why we've separated out the capital costs associated with ride-hailing and delivery versus individual motorbikes. And then rooftop solar, $1.3 billion in private and public buildings, $36.1 billion in residential. In residential, we also segment out grid-fed and non-grid-fed, and there's specific policy issues in Vietnam with regards to the law on public asset management that disallow or that don't explicitly enable rooftop solar. This is an example of where Ministry of Finance can unlock an opportunity, because right now it's blocked in Vietnam. So there are other small pieces of legal and regulatory frameworks that may be inhibiting. Similarly, in Vietnam, right now there's no ability to feed in new power into the grid. Well, Ministry of Finance can have an important role in being able to unlock that, which makes these much more attractive because battery and rooftop just doesn't make any financial sense. So how can a Ministry of Finance enable these types of investments to flow really significant resources into an environment that is interesting from a returns perspective, interesting from a buyer's perspective, and will enable or support achieving NDCs. So again, going back to that point, thinking in Ho Chi Minh, talking about 109 million tons over 10 years. That again is quite high relative to the 146 million tons by 2030 that the government is committing. In addition, you have a subnational government that's able to simply connect private asset owners that don't have access to voluntary market themselves to the voluntary market. So subnational government is working as an aggregator and a transaction agent to enable private sector to make these investments. Private sector making these investments is not coming onto the government's budget. So how can a Ministry of Finance enable the flow of funds so that an individual asset owner can be compensated by a subnational government for those investments? And we have something called a benefit sharing program in Vietnam, as well as many countries in this region for the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. There's already fund flow arrangements that are out there that show international money coming to pay private individuals for actions that they make. This is another area where Ministry of Finance can come and provide the type of guidance that is necessary for individuals to access this market, to make the interventions that make financial sense, to operate in a market that is active because there's so much activity happening to result in ultimately cleaner cities, better air quality, and moving towards a net zero world. So this is just what I wanted to show. It's a little bit of a flavor of what we're working on, not just with the government of Vietnam, but also in Thailand and starting discussions in other countries in the region. We think that this idea has quite a lot of traction, and we would be very happy to follow up with you all. The last thing I would note is that this takes some time to process. This takes some time to understand these markets. It takes some time to understand pricing volatility, for example. And we're working also with the government of Singapore as a knowledge hub to bring folks from ministries of finance to understand how it is that the financial markets are there, the service providers are there, the transaction advisors, the banks, et cetera, are there to be able to catalyze that market for the region. So hopefully, over time, some of you could come to Singapore through one of the types of events that we will be organizing on a very regular basis going forward, understand a little bit more about this, and be able to consider applying this type of approach in your own country. So with that, I think I'll conclude, and thank you for your time.